April 3, 1942. Good Friday. The dense, suffocating jungles of Mount Samat on the Bataan Peninsula. The morning air is choked with oppressive heat and the sweet, sickly smell of rotting vegetation. In the shallow, hastily dug foxholes cut into the forward slopes, American and Filipino defenders wait in absolute, terrified silence. They are starving, ravaged by malaria, and exhausted beyond human limits. Many wear the flat, wide-brimmed doughboy helmets of the First World War, clutching obsolete rifles and improvised glass bottle explosives. Then, the sky begins to vibrate. A low mechanical drone builds into a deafening roar as 82 Japanese bombers block out the tropical sun. The earth suddenly fractures. A localized apocalypse is unleashed as 196 Japanese artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. High explosive shells systematically erase the jungle canopy, turning century-old trees into lethal splinters. The ground liquefies under the relentless creeping barrage. This is not a standard infantry assault. This is a synchronized, overwhelming mechanical slaughter designed to shatter the very minds of the defenders before the armor even advances. The Japanese blitz on Bataan has begun. To understand the sheer brutality of the April 1942 offensive, one must first examine the collapsing strategic architecture of the Pacific Theater. In the immediate aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Imperial Japanese military unleashes a synchronized, devastating wave of conquests across Asia. The Philippine archipelago, serving as the central pillar of American military projection in the Far East, is targeted for immediate subjugation. The pre-war defensive doctrine, known as War Plan Orange 3, is rapidly triggered. It dictates a massive fighting withdrawal of all available American and Filipino units away from the open plains of Manila and into the dense mountainous jungle of the Bataan Peninsula. Bataan is a rugged thumb of land pointing south into Manila Bay. Geographically, it is a natural fortress defined by jagged volcanic peaks, deep ravines, and suffocating tropical foliage. But a fortress without a functional supply line is merely an open-air prison. By the spring of 1942, tens of thousands of American and Filipino forces find themselves squeezed tightly into a steadily shrinking defensive pocket on this peninsula. They are entirely severed from the outside world. The United States Pacific Fleet is paralyzed. The skies above belong entirely to the Japanese. The men on the ground know with absolute chilling certainty that no naval convoy is coming to save them. There will be no reinforcements. There will be no resupply. The physical deterioration of the defending army is absolute. The men holding the final defensive perimeter, known as the Orion-Bagac line, are ghosts draped in sweat-stained khaki. Cut off from logistics, they are surviving on fractions of standard field rations, eventually forced to slaughter their own cavalry horses and hunt monkeys in the canopy just to stave off starvation. Medical stockpiles are completely exhausted. The jungle itself becomes a secondary enemy, as malaria, dysentery, and beriberi ravage the ranks, quietly inflicting more casualties than enemy ballistics. Many of these exhausted defenders are equipped with antiquated gear, wearing the flat, wide-brimmed doughboy helmets of the First World War. When Japanese armor periodically probes their lines, these desperate men are forced to rely on improvised Molotov cocktails to halt the steel beasts. Yet, despite being pushed past the limits of human endurance, they hold their ground. Across the wire, the perspective of the Imperial Japanese Army is shifting from confident aggression to deep operational frustration. Lieutenant General Masahiro Homa, the commander tasked with securing the Philippines, is dangerously behind the strict timetable set by Tokyo. The stubborn, hollowed-out tenacity of the American and Filipino defenders has stalled his initial advances and humiliated the Japanese high command. Recognizing that light infantry tactics are failing against the fortified jungle positions, Hama halts his ground offensive to orchestrate a massive buildup of heavy ordnance. He will no longer attempt to simply push the defenders back. He will pulverize the peninsula into submission. The Japanese command formulates a final decisive operation. Seeking to definitively overwhelm the starving defenders, they prepare to launch a highly coordinated land and air assault converging from 3 separate directions. The operational objective is to achieve a sudden, paralyzing shock effect entirely comparable to the German Blitzkrieg doctrine deployed in Europe, violently adapted for the claustrophobic nightmare of the Pacific theater. The focal point of this impending annihilation is Mount Samat, rising sharply from the jungle floor. Mount Samat anchors the center of the Allied defensive perimeter. It offers commanding views and vital artillery observation over the entire front line. If the Japanese can shatter the defenses here and take the mountain, the Allied line will physically snap in half, triggering a complete collapse of the Bataan pocket. To ensure this happens, the Japanese secretly move an overwhelming concentration of firepower into the surrounding tree line. They assemble an estimated 196 artillery weapons, ranging from heavy siege batteries to rapid-fire mortar, pointing them directly at the forward slopes of the mountain. The air is heavy, still, and suffocatingly hot as the month of April begins, carrying the distinct metallic weight of an impending slaughter. The geography of the Orion-Bagac line dictates a brutal close-quarters reality. The defending Allied forces, primarily composed of the Philippine Commonwealth Army's 41st and 21st Divisions, alongside elements of the American 31st Infantry, are dug into the dense, unforgiving slopes of Mount Samat. Major General Edward P. King, commanding the battered Luzon force, intimately understands the precariousness of his position. The logistical lifeline has been entirely severed. His men are surviving on a fraction of their daily caloric requirements, stripping the jungle of roots, monkeys, and even their own cavalry mounts to stave off starvation. They are a skeletal army, haunted by the ravages of severe malnutrition. The medical crisis is even more catastrophic. Stockpiles of quinine are depleted, allowing malaria, dengue, and dysentery to decimate the ranks with impunity. Their defensive works are not the grand concrete fortifications of Europe. They are hastily excavated foxholes, shallow trenches cut through thick root systems, and camouflaged machine gun nests hidden beneath a suffocating canopy. Across the dense tropical expanse, the Imperial Japanese Army prepares to execute a doctrine of localized annihilation. Lieutenant General Masaharu Hama, deeply frustrated by the protracted stalemate and facing severe pressure from Tokyo, delegates the orchestration of this destruction to his Chief of Artillery, Lieutenant General Kusuko Kitajima. Kitajima's tactical calculus is cold and entirely unprecedented in the Pacific theater. He does not plan for a standard creeping barrage to merely cover an infantry advance. He plans to completely liquefy the Allied front line. The concentration of firepower amassed along the perimeter is staggering. 196 heavy artillery pieces, including 150 mm howitzers and 240 mm siege mortar, are systematically registered onto the Allied coordinates. The Japanese batteries are packed so tightly along the muddy jungle supply roads that their wheel hubs nearly touch. This massive ground assault is designed to operate in flawless synchronization with a devastating aerial component. Japanese bomber squadrons are fueled and armed on captured airfields to the north. 82 twin-engine aircraft are prepared to deliver incendiary and high-explosive payloads directly onto the Allied rear echelons, command centers, and artillery observation posts. The operational intent is to create a complete three-dimensional envelope of destruction. By combining overwhelming artillery saturation with relentless aerial bombardment, the Japanese aim to sever all Allied communication wire, incinerate the jungle cover, and induce mass psychological paralysis before a single Japanese infantryman steps into the line of fire. It is a terrifying translation of the mechanized Blitzkrieg into a tropical environment. The build-up to this assault is characterized by a heavy, terrifying silence. The Japanese temporarily cease their probing infantry attacks, allowing a deceptive calm to settle over the Bataan Peninsula in the first days of April. For the exhausted American and Filipino defenders, this quiet is not a reprieve. It is the agonizing suspense of an executioner slowly raising his axe. Under the cover of darkness, they can hear the mechanical grind of heavy tractors pulling siege guns into position and the clanking of tank treads echoing through the jungle valleys. They know the Japanese are massing for a decisive, final blow, but the thick jungle canopy obscures the sheer scale of the mechanized terror gathering just miles from their shallow trenches. April 3, 1942, arrives. It is Good Friday. The morning breaks clear and oppressively hot, the tropical sun baking the parched earth of the Orion-Bagac line. The defenders, gripped by the exhaustion of 100 days of continuous combat, settle into their firing positions. The air is entirely still. There's no pre-assault skirmishing, no probing rifle fire. The quiet stretches over the rugged volcanic slopes of Mount Samat, absolute and heavy with anticipation. Then, at precisely 0900 hours, the sky begins to tear apart. The distant, synchronized thunder of Kitajima's artillery batteries erupts across the Japanese rear echelons. It is not a gradual escalation. It is an instantaneous, cataclysmic war. At precisely 9 o'clock hours, the jungle canopy of Mount Samat simply ceases to exist. Lieutenant General Kitajima unleashes his massed batteries, firing an estimated 196 heavy artillery pieces and mortar in a synchronized symphony of mechanized destruction. This is not a scattered, harassing bombardment. It is a meticulously calculated grid of total annihilation. The forward slopes of the mountain are subjected to a continuous, creeping barrage that churns the ancient volcanic earth into a blinding, suffocating storm of pulverized dirt, splintered wood, and razor-sharp shrapnel. Giant teak and mahogany trees, which have stood for centuries, are violently uprooted by the sheer kinetic force of the 150 mm and 240 mm shells hurled through the dense air like massive wooden projectiles. The physical concussions of the heavy ordnance create localized vacuums, collapsing the hastily dug, shallow foxholes and burying the exhausted defenders alive beneath the dark soil. For the men of the Philippine Commonwealth Army's 41st and 21st Divisions, caught directly in the epicenter of the blast radius, there is no possible tactical response. There is no maneuver. There is only the overwhelming, deafening roar of industrial steel systematically tearing the jungle apart. The barrage rolls inexorably upward across the terrain, vaporizing the carefully camouflaged defensive hardpoints and turning the once impenetrable forest into a scarred, smoking lunar landscape. The horizontal destruction from the heavy artillery is immediately compounded by a terrifying vertical nightmare. Operating with absolute, uncontested air supremacy, 82 Japanese twin-engine bombers descend upon the peninsula in rigid, disciplined formations. Their targets are not the frontline trenches, but the fragile nervous system of the Allied defense. They drop hundreds of tons of high explosives and incendiary payloads directly onto the rear echelons, battalion command posts, and vital artillery observation positions situated high on the mountain's ridges. The dense tropical jungle, dry from the approaching peak of the Philippine summer heat, instantly ignites. Towering walls of flame race through the thick underbrush, creating a suffocating, rapidly spreading inferno that traps isolated platoons behind a curtain of fire. The intricate, fragile network of telephone wire, the single lifeline connecting the forward trenches to Major General King's headquarters, is severed in thousands of places within the first hour of the assault. The coordinated bombardment effectively blinds and deafens the Allied military leadership. Battalions are violently cut off from their regiments, and company commanders lose all communication with their forward rifle squads. The rigid defense of Mount Samat rapidly dissolves into a chaotic, fragmented struggle for basic survival amid the burning timber and blinding smoke. Beneath this apocalyptic firestorm, the human reality of the defense becomes a grim testament to raw, stubborn endurance. The men trapped in the forward trenches are effectively fighting a modern, mechanized war while equipped with the discarded technology of a previous era. Crouched low in the trembling earth, many American and Filipino soldiers wear the flat, wide-brimmed doughboy helmets of the First World War, gripping their obsolete, bolt-action Springfield rifles as the ground shakes violently beneath their boots. The air in the trenches is thick, heavy with the bitter, metallic scent of explosives and the suffocating black smoke of burning tropical vegetation. They possess virtually no dedicated anti-tank weaponry left to repel the armored columns they know are idling just behind the artillery curtain. Instead, to counter the impending threat of Japanese steel, they clutch hastily constructed Molotov cocktails, fragile glass bottles filled with scavenged gasoline and stuffed with rags, waiting for the terrifying moment they must hurl them by hand against hardened armor. The psychological toll of enduring 5 hours of continuous, unanswered bombardment pushes the human mind to its absolute breaking point, stripping away all grand illusions of warfare and leaving only the visceral instinct to survive the next concussive blast. Yet, the true terror of this Good Friday is not merely the staggering volume of explosives, but the mechanized infantry assault waiting patiently just beyond the clearing smoke. As the 5-hour artillery barrage finally begins to shift its focus deeper into the Allied rear, the deafening roar of high explosives is replaced by a different, distinctly mechanical terror. Through the thick, acrid smoke of the burning mahogany trees, the grinding squeal of steel treads echoes across the shattered lines. Elements of the Japanese 4th Tank Regiment, deploying Type 89 medium and Type 95 light tanks, spearhead the advance into the pulverized terrain. In the dense, claustrophobic confines of the Bataan Peninsula, armored warfare is traditionally a logistical nightmare, but the relentless bombardment has effectively paved a highway of destruction, stripping the jungle of its natural anti-tank obstacles. Behind this wall of moving steel, the veteran Japanese infantry flows forward. They are rested, heavily supplied, and moving with terrifying, practiced synchronization. They do not charge blindly. They utilize the massive craters created by their own artillery as cover, systematically sweeping the surviving Allied foxholes with concentrated machine gun fire. For the surviving remnants of the 41st and 21st Divisions, the engagement immediately transitions from passive survival beneath the bombardment into desperate, point-blank combat. Without dedicated heavy anti-tank batteries to pierce the Japanese armor, the defense relies entirely on raw, suicidal bravery. Starving Filipino and American troops, their faces blackened by soot and cordite, are forced to engage the tanks at zero range. They leap from their crumbling trenches, hurling their improvised Molotov cocktails against the engine decks and viewing slits of the advancing steel beasts. It is a terrifying, heartbreaking mismatch of modern mechanized momentum against exhausted men fighting with glass bottles, bayonets, and antiquated First World War doughboy helmets. The jungle, which had previously served as their greatest equalizer and primary shield, has been burned away entirely, leaving the defenders completely exposed on the scarred slopes of Mount Samat. Miles behind this rapidly dissolving front line, the tactical situation at Major General Edward P. King's Luzon Force Headquarters degenerates into absolute blindness. The sheer, unprecedented volume of the Japanese bombardment has permanently severed the intricate, fragile network of field telephone wires. Runners sent forward into the inferno simply do not return. Radios, already scarce and heavily degraded by months in the humid tropical environment, are rendered virtually useless by the mountainous terrain and the sheer chaos of the retreat. King and his general staff are effectively deafened and blinded. They can physically feel the rolling thunder of the assault tearing Mount Samat apart, but they receive no accurate casualty reports, no defensive coordinates, and no tangible intelligence regarding the depth of the Japanese penetration. The Allied command structure does not break from a lack of resolve or courage. It is systematically dismantled by the fog of war, artificially thickened by Japanese high explosives. By the late afternoon of April 3rd, the grim mathematical reality of the Japanese Blitzkrieg doctrine is fully realized. The synchronized, overlapping application of heavy artillery, aerial bombardment, and armored spearheads has achieved exactly what the Imperial High Command demanded. The Orion-Bagac line is not merely bent or pushed back. It is violently, irreparably shattered. The Japanese armored columns have ripped a massive bleeding hole straight through the physical and psychological center of the Allied defenses. The isolated platoons and companies that remain stubbornly in their positions are rapidly being bypassed, surrounded, and systematically annihilated by the trailing infantry. The shock is absolute. Mount Samat, the towering anchor of the American and Filipino defensive strategy, is falling, and with it, the entire defensive calculus of the Bataan Peninsula begins to collapse into a chaotic, uncoordinated fighting retreat. By the morning of April 4th, the tactical fissure at the base of Mount Samat violently rips open into a catastrophic miles-wide breach. Recognizing the total collapse of the Philippine Commonwealth's 41st Division, immediately pours their reserves into the void. Elements of the Japanese 4th Division and the 65th Independent Mixed Brigade surge forward, exploiting the gap with a speed that entirely paralyzes the Allied response. The jungle, still smoldering from the initial Good Friday bombardment, offers no sanctuary. The air is thick with the stench of cordite, burning vegetation, and unburied dead. For the surviving American and Filipino forces, the battlefield has devolved into a terrifying fragmented nightmare of isolated skirmishes and desperate, blind retreats. Commanding the rapidly disintegrating Luzon force from his command post in the rear, is operating in a state of near-total informational blackout. The relentless Japanese aerial assault continues to sever newly laid telephone wire, and the few dispatch runners who manage to survive the gauntlet bring back reports that are already hours out of date. King attempts to execute the only tactical maneuver available to him, a desperate, coordinated counterattack designed to plug the massive hole in the Orion-Bagac line. He commits his final reserves, ordering the American 31st Infantry Regiment to advance directly into the teeth of the Japanese offensive. It is an order that demands the impossible. They are asked to move forward through the treacherous, ash-choked terrain, carrying their heavy gear, without any artillery support, and completely exposed to the Japanese bombers circling uncontested above. As they attempt to advance and re-establish a contiguous front line, they are violently intercepted by organized, heavily armed Japanese columns supported by Type 89 medium tanks. The resulting collision is not a battle. It is an immediate, localized slaughter. The counterattack shatters almost as soon as it begins, the exhausted American infantrymen forced to fall back under a withering hail of automatic weapons, fire and mortar barrages. By April 6th, the concept of a unified Allied front on the Bataan Peninsula ceases to exist. The defensive strategy transitions into a chaotic, uncoordinated fighting retreat down the eastern coastal road. The Imperial Japanese Army, maintaining their relentless synchronized pressure, shifts their mechanized columns to cut off these retreating elements. The Japanese blitz has achieved a terrifying, unstoppable momentum. The physical geography of Bataan, once considered the defenders' greatest asset, now transforms into an inescapable trap. The rugged volcanic ravines and the dense, burning underbrush funnel the retreating units into congested, panic-stricken choke points. Along the dusty, congested jungle trails, the true horror of the collapse manifests. The retreat is not orderly, and skeletal stragglers intermingled with fleeing civilian refugees. They are strafed relentlessly by Japanese Zeros that swoop low over the canopy, raking the crowded roads with machine gun fire. The sheer, overwhelming volume of Japanese ordnance continues to fall. The initial 5-hour barrage that opened the offensive was merely the overture. The heavy artillery has now displaced forward, firing continuously to ensure the Allied forces cannot establish a secondary defensive line. The Philippine 21st Division, which had stubbornly held its sector against the initial probing attacks, finds its flanks entirely exposed by the collapse of the center. Surrounded, out of ammunition, and facing concentrated armor attacks, they are systematically annihilated in detail. The localized pockets of resistance that stubbornly refuse to yield are bypassed by the main Japanese columns and left to be eradicated by trailing infantry, clearing the pockets with flamethrowers and bayonets. The Allied command structure physically dissolves. Officers lose contact with their men in the suffocating smoke. Units become hopelessly intertwined in the dark jungle. The Bataan defense is no longer an army. It is a mass of hunted, starving men running out of ground, backed against the dark waters of Manila Bay. In his stifling makeshift headquarters, Major General King stares at maps that no longer represent reality. He knows his men are dying of dysentery and malaria just as rapidly as they are falling to Japanese shrapnel. He knows their First World War-era doughboy helmets and improvised glass bottle explosives offer no tangible defense against the modern, mechanized reality crashing down upon them. The realization settling over the Allied High Command is cold and absolute. There is no tactical genius, no strategic redeployment that can halt the momentum of this assault. The peninsula is lost. The only remaining variable is how many thousands of men will be slaughtered before the final, inevitable capitulation. The fighting descends from military maneuvers into raw, primal survival. By April 7th, the organized defense of the Bataan Peninsula dissolves into a desperate, bleeding exodus. The Japanese Blitzkrieg, perfectly adapted for the tropical theater, has completely unspooled the Allied defensive architecture. Burning jungle with mechanical precision, effectively amputating entire battalions from their parent regiments. The remaining elements of the American and Filipino forces are pushed relentlessly southward, funneled down the congested coastal roads toward the dead-end port of Ravaged. The sky above remains a domain of absolute Japanese supremacy. Twin-engine bombers circle like vultures, dropping incendiaries and high explosives on the chaotic columns of retreating soldiers and terrified civilian refugees. The physical condition of the retreating army enters a state of catastrophic failure. The men stumbling down the dusty, rutted trails are not a fighting force. They are a collection of starving, diseased specters. Cut off from all medical supplies and subsisting on a few ounces of rice a day, they are ravaged by dysentery, dengue fever, and cerebral malaria. Men simply collapse on the side of the road, their bodies entirely consumed by the jungle environment before enemy shrapnel can even reach them. Yet, the Japanese artillery does not rest. The 196 heavy guns and mortar that initiated the Good Friday slaughter are continuously displaced forward, maintaining a suffocating blanket of fire over the retreating columns. The deafening, concussive rhythm of the bombardment ensures that the exhausted defenders cannot regroup, cannot sleep, and cannot breathe without inhaling the pulverized ash of the Bataan forest. In his subterranean command bunker, Major General Edward P. King faces an impossible, agonizing calculus. The directives radiating from General MacArthur's headquarters in Australia are unambiguous. But King knows the grim, undeniable reality on the ground. He receives reports of American and Filipino soldiers wearing obsolete First World War doughboy helmets, being crushed under the treads of Japanese Type 89 tanks because they are physically too weak to pull themselves out of their shallow foxholes. He knows the ammunition magazines are virtually empty. He knows the hospitals are overflowing with thousands of untreated wounded, lying in the open air, highly vulnerable to the relentless aerial strafing. To obey the order to counterattack is to order the systematic, unmitigated slaughter of 75,000 men. King is forced to choose between his career, his standing orders, and the sheer biological survival of the army entrusted to his command. Recognizing that the perimeter has terminally collapsed, Allied engineers receive the grim order to destroy anything of military value to prevent its capture by the advancing Japanese columns. Massive ammunition dumps, containing millions of rounds of small arms fire and thousands of artillery shells, are rigged with heavy explosives. As midnight approaches, the demolitions are triggered. The resulting explosions are cataclysmic, dwarfing even the intense Japanese bombardment. The night sky is instantly illuminated by blinding localized suns. The shockwaves register like intense seismic events, violently shaking the earth and throwing a dense black canopy of smoke across the stars. Naval vessels scuttled in Manila Bay burn brightly against the dark water, painting the harbor in a demonic flickering orange light. Through this apocalyptic backdrop, the final realization settles over the Allied High Command. The physical limits of human endurance have not just been met. They have been catastrophically exceeded. The mechanized terror of the Japanese offensive, the synchronized crush of heavy artillery, armor, and air power has achieved its ultimate objective. As the sun rises on the morning of April 9, 1942, the tropical heat returns to the pulverized ridges of Mount Samat and the congested roads of Mariveles. Sends forward a solitary jeep bearing a white bedsheet tied to a bamboo pole. He rides to the front lines to meet with the commanders of the Imperial Japanese Army. The decisive moment is not marked by a final glorious infantry charge, but by a quiet, agonizing submission. To save his starving, hollowed-out men from total annihilation, King surrenders the Bataan Peninsula. The defense is over. The guns fall silent, but for the 75,000 captured men, the true nightmare of Bataan is only just beginning. The defense of the Bataan Peninsula is often overshadowed by the sheer, unmitigated horror of its aftermath. The Bataan Death March is rightfully seared into the global consciousness as a stark, agonizing reminder of the atrocities that defined the Pacific War. Yet, to fully grasp the magnitude of the tragedy of Bataan, we must remember the men before they were prisoners. We must remember the soldiers holding the shallow foxholes on the slopes of Mount Samat. They were, by all military definitions, a forgotten army. Abandoned by logistics, cut off from reinforcement, and hollowed out by tropical disease, they were pushed far beyond the accepted limits of human endurance. They stood directly in the path of a highly synchronized, mechanized Blitzkrieg, facing a terrifying concentration of heavy siege artillery, armored columns, and uncontested air power. Against this modern, industrial war machine, they wielded antiquated rifles, First World War-era helmets, improvised glass bottle explosives, and a raw, stubborn defiance. Operationally, the final Japanese offensive of April 1942 was a masterclass in localized annihilation. It shattered the Orion-Bagac line and achieved its tactical objectives with ruthless, mechanical efficiency. But the true historical legacy of Bataan is not found in the victory of the Imperial Japanese Army. It is found in the agonizing, bloody months of delay they suffered to achieve it. By refusing to capitulate when the math of their survival reached zero, the starving defenders of Bataan bought the Allied forces across the Pacific the one resource that could not be manufactured: time. Today, the summit of Mount Samat is crowned by a towering memorial cross, casting a long, quiet shadow over the recovered jungle canopy. The massive craters left by the heavy siege guns have been swallowed by decades of dense tropical growth. The rusted steel of the doughboy helmets and the scattered brass of the Springfield rifles have long since degraded into the dark volcanic soil. The Bataan Peninsula is at peace. But the memory of the men who held the line on Good Friday remains a permanent testament to the absolute limits of human endurance, a haunting reminder that even when the artillery shatters the earth and the armor breaks the lines, the courage of the defense can echo long